It's 10:15 in the morning and it's freaking hot outside, so I'll try to keep it short. A month or so must have already passed since I had finally got myself a drum set, and throughout that period I learned a relatively, I suppose, high number of at least complex groups. I asked myself about the reason why it is so easy for me to learn drums in comparison to piano. Truthfully, I find it bizarre that my progress is so dreadful since I used to enjoy playing it so much. In fact, a great number of musicians I idolize is made up of pianists, and I used to listen to soul piano genre almost exclusively. It's not that I'm not fond of drumming as much, it's just that I did not grow up being a musician, and since drummers are so often overshadowed by their colleagues, I simply wouldn't learn the names, and that's why I decided to get a little deeper in the mechanism of learning to play an instrument. I'll get quite a few things noted down, but I'll keep this video concise. Nonetheless, I will brief you through the neurophysiological details I feel like are important in the case of mastering an instrument, or exertion to put it simply. So the big question is about what distinguishes my practice session. And the very first thing that came to my mind was fatigue, by which I mean physical exertion. Piano playing, just like the guitar, is very often described as an acquired through training ability to use micro muscles, the ones an average human being doesn't have so extensively developed, since precision of his hands movement isn't so necessary. Contrary to that, even though drummers utilize all those muscles in order to stick correctly, to be able to play complex JDBX style, for example rhythms, they have to rely on the body strength to a much greater extent than hand-based instrumentalists do, which leads to physical fatigue, such as muscle soreness and big amounts of sweat being excreted from the body, of course. And that occurred to me as the main difference. The second one, possibly also contributory, is the fact that I play drums wearing heavy-duty ear protection. So the thing is that I'm very conscious about my playing, and my lack of progress could potentially be anxiety driven. I mean, throughout the summertime I play with my windows open, which leaves me exposed in a way. And my neighbor is a part-time piano teacher whom I sometimes hear play, and who I wouldn't necessarily want to hear me walking my way through a branch while she's out there gardening. And so playing in a semi-isolated scenario, just like my drumming practice is, despite the fact that I'm pretty much convinced I'm being listened to, I forget about the surrounding me and enclosed with headphones, can potentially be very beneficial to my playing. That's the second thought of mine. I'll quote my notes now. From what I have already written down, one could assume, as would I, that it's either the energy put into the work, as in my hypotheses, for I'm eager to suppose that it has to do with the release during training hormones, or the active meditation for isolation that make it relatively easy for me to learn drums. One thing that should parenthetically be mentioned is the difference in material quality and quantity. Drum grooves are simply easier to be put in the context of a random song than an actual piano part is, as well as the transposition factor, it being the realization that when it comes to drums, transposition can be brought down to choosing a different set of drum parts. So grooves being more future-proof may be subconsciously viewed as more important. Okay, now I'll brief you through the physiology of drumming, or in fact through kinesiology. Now, when kinesiology is brought forward, it's usually the sportsmen that are examined. And it isn't surprising at all, since it's a field of study that deals with movement. But I, because of the sheer amount of energy being released during a session that engages so many muscle groups, think of drumming in terms of a sport, basically. And so I dug a little deeper into what is actually released in the brain during exercise, because all the laymen know that euphoric states can be attributed to sports, but there's a little more to it than that. The very first thing that came to my mind, about which I had learned not that long ago, was runner's high. And what it is basically a nirvana-esque euphoric state that some sportsmen claim to experience after a deeply intense practice session. But from what I've gathered, its prevalence is actually unknown. Now, even though it could potentially be elicited by an upsurge of phenylethylamine released during physical activity, it simply can't be what happens in my case, because the signs aren't, I suppose, pertinent enough. Now, have in mind that I'm not saying that it's not phenylethylamine. It's just the lack of info I could find that led me to assume sense pleasure is rooted in endogenous cannabinoids, of which I'm going to discuss one. Also worth mentioning is that I'm deciding not to get into release endorphins because of the study according to which they may actually not be contributory to runner's high. Anandamide is the one cannabinoid I want to focus on, since it's depicted as a partial mediator of mood enhancement during exercise. I'll be getting into the superficial details of hedonic hotspots now. So I'm positive that the process of drumming, very much akin to physical exercise, can be thought of as an intrinsic reward. And why is that, you shall ask, shan't you? There are basically two types of rewards, one of them being the intrinsic one. And I like to think of them as being innate, even though they are said to simply be unconditioned. The other group that falls under the same category is a group that consists of extrinsic rewards. And those are the ones learned through association. They both of course elicit pleasure, but I feel like the sensation elicited by the second group has to do with the first one being partially responsible for the second one, and the second one in a way relying on the first one to elicit pleasure that allows the actual association. The one thing I don't really like about this theory is used terminology. I feel like instead of calling them rewards, we should think of those things in terms of triggers that set off dopamine release. But who am I to judge? There are quite a few hotspots in the brain, of which I'll only be dealing with the nucleus accumbens. But in order for it to work, every single one has to be partially engaged, for they each allow others' activity. Said nucleus rewards actions with stimuli, allowing the brain to develop motivation to perform those actions in the future. One could possibly be wondering why it is the accumbens that I decided to discuss, and the reason for it has to do with that very specific anandamide I have aforementioned. So the anandamide is thought to be able to cross the blood-brain barrier, which could potentially allow it to get into the accumbens, and from what I've gathered, there have been various studies conducted, in the course of which anandamide was injected into mice accumbens shell, increasing its activity, and it was thereby concluded that fondness of rewards is elevated under the influence of anandamide. And all that theory led me to infer that physical exercise, including large muscle-dependent musical instrument practice, should have a promising, at the very least, hedonic impact on intrinsic rewards. Another study shows that it's a dopamine secretion that is increased after treatment with anandamide. Now that I've concluded that it could be the accumbens related euphoria that makes it easier, and in fact more pleasurable for me to play drums than it is to play piano, I asked myself if elevating the levels of accumbens released dopamine during my piano playing could potentially be beneficial to my learning process. The next thing I'd like to discuss is the relevance of dopamine outbursts causing videos. At first I thought about the short form, TikTok-alike multimedia, but then after I read a study published by Brown, according to which there has been at some point conducted a study, subjects of which were shown their own posted prior to the experiment pictures with altered numbers of likes, which resulted in an upsurge in accumbens activity. Another idea came to my mind. While the study was supposed to bring the mechanism of developing an addiction to light, another thing was brought to my attention. Since the rewards in the form of multimedia are mirroring our desire for acceptance, attainment of which activates accumbens, I thought I could elevate dopamine level, increasing effectiveness of my practice, telling myself or being told that I'm doing a good job. And so I thought I could conduct a little experiment myself, doing exactly that, playing under various different circumstances. And I truly encourage you to do the same, all the science aside. Try to find out what your ideal practice session should look like. Cheers.